My name is Claire Donovan, 33 years old, and until that winter evening, I thought I understood my place in the world. I was the quiet daughter of a man who built skyscrapers and broke people without blinking. The one who smiled politely at family galas, restored old paintings in silence, and tried not to embarrass anyone with her existence. I never asked for my father's empire only for him to see me as something more than an afterthought. But standing under 1,000 chandeliers at his 70th birthday party, I was about to learn how easily a single moment could erase an entire lifetime. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever felt invisible in your own family. I grew up in a house that never echoed with laughter, only the sound of money being counted and reputations being polished. My father, Edward Donovan, built his fortune on real estate and intimidation. He believed affection was weakness and that success was proof of worth. My mother died when I was young, and not long after Vivian arrived, graceful, polished, and as cold as the marble floors she loved to walk on. She knew how to play her part, smiling for photographs, keeping her voice low, and never contradicting him in public. My younger brother Ryan was the crown jewel, the son who could do no wrong, the heir everyone toasted to at every dinner table. While they built empires and hosted fundraisers, I learned the quiet craft of restoring things time forgot. The smell of linseed oil and varnish became my comfort, the soft light of a studio lamp my refuge. My father never understood it. "You fix other people's junk," he once said, swirling his glass of scotch as if the word art tasted sour. He wanted me in boardrooms. I wanted to breathe, so I kept my head down, showed up to his events when required, and let the distance between us harden into routine. The world saw us as the perfect family: tuxedos, pearls, charity auctions, but I knew the truth. Perfection was just control wearing a smile. That December night, Chicago shimmered beneath fresh snow, and the Donovan ballroom glowed with gold and champagne. My father's guests filled the room, senators, investors, the kind of people who treated sincerity like bad etiquette. I stood near the bar listening to the hum of polite laughter, wearing the same cautious smile I'd worn all my life. Vivian floated past in emerald silk, whispering instructions to the catering staff as if every detail could buy her peace. Ryan basked in attention, retelling some story about his latest deal while I tried to disappear into the wallpaper. When my father spotted me, his expression tightened the way it always did when he saw I still hadn't turned into the daughter he wanted. He beckoned me closer for a family photo, and for a fleeting second, I hoped maybe tonight would be different. Maybe 70 years of life had softened him. Maybe this would be the night he'd finally say he was proud. But the look in his eyes told me I was wrong. Behind that polished smile was something coiled and ready to strike. As the cameras flashed and the pianist played another round of holiday jazz, I felt that familiar weight of pretending. Pretending we were close, pretending I wasn't invisible. I tried to steady my breath, but his voice cut through the room like glass sharp, commanding, meant to be heard by everyone. I didn't know then what words were coming or how the night would end, but the air around us had already changed. The laughter dimmed, the chandelier light seemed colder, and somewhere deep down, I felt at the edge of something breaking. The guests clinked their glasses oblivious as my father turned to face me with that smile I'd feared since childhood. The moment stretched thin like a canvas about to tear. I didn't know it yet, but in the next heartbeat, everything I believed about who I was, my name, my family, even my own blood, was about to unravel completely. The air inside the ballroom had felt thin before, but when my father raised his glass and called my name, something in the room shifted. The laughter dulled, replaced by the faint clinking of crystal. I turned toward him, trying to steady my breath, my smile fixed in place. He took one step closer, his jaw, tight eyes like steel under the chandeliers. The slap came before I understood what was happening. The sound echoed through the hall, sharp, hollow, final. I remember the taste of champagne and salt as my eyes filled the crowd's shock, hanging heavy like smoke. My father's voice rose above the murmurs. "You're a disgrace to this family, Claire. Consider yourself cut out of my will." The flashes from phones blinded me. Someone gasped. Others whispered. Vivian pressed a trembling hand to his arm, whispering for him to stop, but he shook her off with the same cold authority that had ruled our lives. Ryan stood near the edge of the crowd, his mouth tight, his eyes flickering with something between pity and relief. I walked out without a word, the marble floor stretching long and endless beneath my heels. Outside, the December snow fell in soft flakes, catching the glow of streetlights as I stood there alone, shaking in the cold. By the time I reached my apartment, the internet had already turned my humiliation into entertainment. Billionaire slap's daughter at birthday gala scrolled across every headline. I shut off my phone and leaned against the door, sliding down until I hit the floor. My cheek burned where his hand had landed, but it was the silence that hurt worse. I had spent my whole life trying to make him proud, and in one moment he'd turned me into a public spectacle. I whispered to myself that I was free now, though the words sounded empty. Freedom shouldn't feel like falling. The next morning, a sharp, deliberate knock pulled me from the quiet. It wasn't the media. They would have shouted my name through the door. This knock was precise 3 measured raps that made my coffee tremble in the mug. I opened the door halfway. 3 strangers stood there, all in dark coats, faces calm and composed. The woman in front extended a card. Judith Blackwell, senior partner at Blackwell & Hartman. "May we come in, Miss Donovan?" Her tone was gentle, but carried a weight that left no room for refusal. I stepped aside, letting them in. The older man, Mark Reeves, nodded politely, while the younger one, Daniel Chen, set a briefcase on my kitchen table. Judith's gaze swept across my apartment, the half-finished painting on the easel, the coffee rings on the counter before she sat down, folding her hands. "We represent a client named Magnus Carver," she said. "He's been searching for someone for a very long time. The name meant nothing. I tried to mask my confusion. "I think you've made a mistake," I said. "My father is Edward Donovan, unfortunately still alive and furious." Judith exchanged a quick look with Daniel, who opened the briefcase and placed a thin folder on the table. "This file," she said, sliding it toward me, "is from a missing child case filed in Portland, Oregon in 1990. The words blurred for a moment before they landed. I laughed nervously, waiting for someone to explain the joke. Judith's expression didn't change. She opened the file, revealing old photographs and yellowed reports. The child's name was Lila Carver, taken from Laurelhurst Park when she was 6 months old. "Your DNA, Miss Donovan, matches hers." For a second, I couldn't breathe. I shook my head. "That's impossible. My parents—" Judith's voice softened. Vivian Donovan was identified in the age-progressed sketches from the original case. The adoption papers your family used were falsified through a private agency overseas. The FBI reopened the case after a genealogy database flagged your DNA. My hands went cold. She laid out a photograph, a man and a woman sitting on a park bench holding a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket. The woman's smile mirrored mine exactly. "Your biological parents, Eleanor and Magnus Carver." Judith said quietly. This was taken 2 weeks before the abduction. The bracelet on the baby's wrist caught my eye, a small silver band engraved with a tiny train. Without thinking, I lifted my own wrist. The same bracelet glinted under the light. I'd worn it all my life. My father Edward had told me it was a family heirloom. My stomach turned as Judith continued. The nanny at the time, Maria Santos, confessed years later that she was paid to look away. She believed it was a private adoption. By the time she realized otherwise, she was too afraid to come forward. Every page they showed me was another cut through the life I thought I knew. Birth certificates, police reports, even a grainy photo of Vivian from 30 years ago. My voice barely carried when I spoke. "So they stole me?" Judith nodded once. "Yes, but you were never forgotten. Mr. Carver has updated his will every year since you disappeared, leaving space for your name in case you were ever found. That's not why we're here, though. He simply wants to meet his daughter." The words hit harder than any slap. I looked toward the window, snow swirling against the glass, the city still gray and waking. "He's alive?" I asked quietly. Judith smiled, small but certain. "He's waiting downstairs." I didn't move at first. My chest felt tight, as if every heartbeat was caught between 2 worlds. Judith stood, giving me time to collect myself. When we finally stepped into the elevator, the metal doors reflected my face, pale. uncertain, no longer sure who I was. The ride felt endless, the air heavy with unspoken things. When the doors opened, sunlight spilled across the lobby floor. A man stood near the entrance, tall and still, his silver hair catching the light. When he saw me, he froze. His eyes, green clear and full of 30 years of waiting, met mine. "Lila," he whispered. My throat closed. I think so." He took one step forward, trembling, then looked down at my wrist. "You still have it," he said softly. "Your mother chose that bracelet. She said you'd love trains." His voice broke on the word. I nodded, unable to speak, tears blurring the edges of the moment. When he reached me, he didn't rush. He simply held out his arms. The smell of cedar and rain surrounded me as I stepped into his embrace. For a long time we said nothing. The world outside carried on, car doors, closing voices echoing, but all I heard was his uneven breathing against my shoulder. When we finally pulled apart, he smiled through tears. "Your mother passed away 5 years ago," he said gently. "But she never stopped believing you'd come home. She left letters for you. The room you were taken from, we never changed it." His words cracked something open inside me, a grief I didn't know I carried. I thought of the marble hall where my father had humiliated me, of Vivian's rehearsed poise, of Ryan's silence. None of them had ever loved me the way this stranger, my real father, did in a single glance. That morning, as snow drifted through the lobby windows, I realized everything I'd believed about my life. Every photograph, every birthday, every family dinner had been built on someone else's heartbreak. And though I didn't know what waited beyond that moment, one truth was already clear: I wasn't a Donovan at all. I was Lila Carver, and my real story was only beginning. The hours after meeting Magnus passed in a haze I could barely hold on to. When he asked if I wanted to leave the building, I nodded, but the world outside felt too bright, too fast. Snow flurries drifted around us as he led me to a dark sedan parked at the curb. Judith waited nearby, her expression soft, as though she understood the weight pressing on my chest. I didn't know where we were going, and I didn't ask. I simply sat in the passenger seat and tried to breathe through the trembling that wouldn't stop. Magnus drove with the quiet ease of a man used to long silences. The city blurred past the windows, bridges, lights, the frozen river. All of it felt foreign. He didn't look at me often, but when he did, his eyes held a gentleness that made it hard to look back. After a few minutes, he said, "You don't have to talk. I just want you to know you're safe." His voice carried the kind of steadiness I hadn't heard in years. It should have been comforting, but it made the ache sharper somehow. We stopped at a hotel near the lake. The lobby was warm, filled with the smell of coffee and wood polish. Magnus handled the check-in quietly, while I stood near the window, staring at the snow piling against the glass. Upstairs, a suite overlooked the frozen shoreline, pale light catching on the ice. He gestured to the sofa. "You can rest here if you'd like. Judith will bring anything you need." Then after a pause, "There's something I'd like you to see." He handed me a small, worn leather album. The corners were frayed, the pages yellowed. When I opened it, I saw photos of a young couple holding a baby in a yellow blanket. My blanket, the same one from the file. Eleanor's smile filled every picture. There were notes beside each photo, written in looping cursive: "First laugh, first snow favorite toy train." My eyes burned as I turned each page. The final one showed a newspaper clipping: "Infant missing from Portland Park." Magnus spoke softly from across the room. "Your mother never stopped believing you'd come home. She wrote you letters every year. They're all waiting for you." His voice caught on the last word. I closed the album and set it carefully on my lap, unable to speak. He told me about the years that followed the searches, the interviews, the endless waiting, how the police had suspected trafficking or illegal adoption but never found proof. I built companies he said I tried to keep moving, but every night I'd hear her cry in my head the sound of losing you. He rubbed a hand across his face, and for the first time I saw the exhaustion behind the composure. When she passed, she made me promise to keep looking. The fire in the room crackled softly. I stared at my bracelet, the small silver train glinting under the light. It was strange how something could survive untouched while everything around it changed. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the hum of the heater and the faint rhythm of our breathing. Later, Judith returned with folders, copies of documents, timelines, official letters. She explained how the FBI had built their case quietly matching DNA from a genealogy site to Magnus's family records. The agents want to move carefully, she said. They know the media will devour this if it leaks too soon. I listened without fully processing her words. All I could think of was Vivian's face, composed and polished, hiding a crime that had stolen an entire life. That night, I lay awake in the hotel room watching the snow drift beyond the glass. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, but I didn't touch it. I knew the messages would be there, reporters' gossip, maybe even Ryan. I couldn't bring myself to open them. The city outside glittered with noise, but inside it was so quiet it almost hurt. The next morning, Magnus knocked gently and asked if I wanted to see something before the day got busy. I followed him downstairs where Judith waited with coffee and a folder in her hand. She handed me a printed statement, a formal request for cooperation in an ongoing investigation. My name was at the top. Claire Donovan, also known as Lila Carver. My hands shook as I read it. "They're going to arrest them, aren't they?" I asked quietly. Judith nodded. "In time. Once the paperwork clears and the evidence is certified." I stared at the words until they blurred. Part of me wanted to run to hide from the storm about to hit. Another part, the quieter, steadier part, wanted to face it. I'd lived my entire life under Edward Donovan's control. If there was ever a moment to reclaim it, it was now. Magnus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. "Your mother took this on your first Christmas," he said, handing it to me. In the picture, a baby lay sleeping beside a wooden toy chest painted sky blue. "We kept that room just as it was," he said softly. "Even after 33 years. He looked at me, then eyes wet. "You're welcome to see it whenever you're ready." The room felt smaller somehow, filled with memories that weren't mine yet felt like they should have been. I tucked the photo into my purse and nodded. "I'll come," I said, my voice unsteady. He smiled faintly. "Take your time. Everything will be waiting." We sat together in silence until Judith's phone buzzed. She excused herself, stepping into the hall. When she returned, her expression was grave. "The Bureau wants to move sooner," she said quietly. "They'll make contact within the week." Magnus's jaw tightened. "Then we'll be ready." The hours that followed blurred together meetings with investigators, quiet drives through the city, long pauses where no words were needed. By the time evening came, Magnus offered to take me back to my apartment. As we reached my street, I saw news vans already parked near the curb. Flashbulbs went off even before I stepped out of the car. I froze, but Magnus rested a hand on my shoulder. "Let them film whatever they want," he said gently. "The truth will speak louder than they can." Inside my apartment, the voicemail light blinked red. I pressed play, and my father's voice filled the room, sharp, controlled, almost rehearsed. "Claire, this nonsense about kidnapping, end it now. You're humiliating yourself." The message ended abruptly. A second one followed, this time from Vivian, her tone brittle and trembling. "Please don't do this. You don't understand what this will destroy." I turned off the phone and sat by the window, the city lights flickering below. In the reflection, I saw both versions of myself, the woman raised by lies and the daughter found by truth. For years, I'd believed silence was survival, that obedience meant safety. But the world had changed overnight, and there was no going back to who I'd been. When I closed my eyes, I saw Magnus's face, Eleanor's handwriting on those photographs, the tiny train on my wrist catching the light. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and disbelief, something steadier had begun to take root, not peace yet, but something close. A quiet, certain understanding that the story my father told the world was about to fall apart. And when it did, I intended to be there to watch it. Snow had fallen again the morning the attorneys arrived at Magnus's office with a heavy envelope marked FBI Confidential. Judith set it on the polished walnut table, her expression steady but grave. "They're ready," she said. Magnus nodded once, his jaw tightening in quiet resolve. I sat across from them, my hands clasped around a coffee mug that had long gone cold. Outside, the city stretched gray and still, the kind of winter day where sound seemed to vanish before it reached you. Judith outlined what would happen: warrants, press control, the timing of arrests. I listened without interrupting, every word sinking in like slow-moving water. The Bureau planned to make their move quietly, but she warned that with Edward Donovan's name attached, nothing would stay quiet for long. When she finished, the room fell into a silence that felt heavier than before. "You don't have to be there," Magnus said gently. "No one expects you to watch." I shook my head. I need to see it. I need to know it's real. That afternoon, we drove to the edge of the Ravenswood Country Club, the same place where my father, No Edward, spent every Tuesday playing golf. We parked across the street, hidden behind rows of snow-dusted pines. Through the window, I could see him on the terrace, laughing with two partners, a man utterly untouched by consequence. Vivian stood beside him, wrapped in a pale coat, sunglasses hiding her eyes. For a moment, they looked exactly as they had that night in the ballroom, polished, composed, certain of their place in the world. Then the line of dark SUVs pulled up, engines, low lights flashing blue against the glass. The moment felt slow and unreal, like watching someone else's memory unfold. Agents stepped out, their navy jackets marked FBI in bold yellow letters. One of them spoke briefly into a radio, and then the doors opened all at once. Laughter faded, heads turned. A few golfers froze mid-swing, unsure whether to watch or look away. The lead agent, a woman with a calm, even voice, approached the terrace. "Edward Donovan, Vivian Donovan, you're under arrest for the kidnapping of Lila Carver committed 33 years ago." The words carried across the winter air, clear enough for everyone to hear. My breath caught. Edward's face went pale, confusion giving way to anger. "What is this?" he barked, taking a step back. "That's my daughter you're talking about." But it wasn't. Not anymore. He tried to argue, his voice cracking, as he turned toward Vivian, but she was already crying, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. "We just wanted a family," she sobbed. "We loved her." The agents didn't respond. They simply guided her toward one of the cars while another pair read Edward his rights. Phones were already out, flashes bursting from every direction. The same society crowd that had once filmed my humiliation now recorded his downfall. Magnus reached over from the driver's seat and rested his hand over mine. "You don't have to keep watching," he said quietly. But I did. I couldn't look away as they led Edward across the snow, his coat pulled tight against the wind. For the first time in my life, he looked small, like the weight of everything he'd built was finally too heavy to carry. When their car doors shut, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. The sirens faded down the road, leaving behind an eerie silence. Magnus started the engine and turned us toward the highway. I kept my eyes on the receding lights until they disappeared. That night, headlines exploded across every screen: billionaire couple arrested in decades-old kidnapping. My phone buzzed non-stop calls from journalists, statements from publicists, even apologies from people I barely remembered. I turned it face down and sat by the window, the city's glow reflecting off the snow. Magnus called to check in, his voice calm but tired. "We'll let the lawyers handle everything," he said. "Try to rest tonight." Rest didn't come easily. I kept replaying the moment, the way Edward's eyes met mine through the crowd before the agents led him away. There had been no rage then, only something closer to regret, maybe even recognition. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't the cold detachment I'd known my whole life either. It was a look that said he finally understood what he'd taken. Over the next few days, everything moved fast. Reporters camped outside my building networks dissected every detail of the case, and my name, both of them, filled the headlines. Judith managed the chaos, issuing statements and blocking interviews. Magnus refused to let the story become spectacle. "We're not selling pain," he said simply. "We're setting the record straight." When the dust began to settle, he asked me to come to Oregon. "It's time," he said, his voice quiet on the phone. "Your mother left something for you." 2 days later, I flew west. The house sat near the coast, nestled between cedar trees that smelled faintly of rain. It wasn't large or grand like the Donovan's mansion, just a 2-story home with blue shutters and a porch that faced the ocean. When we stepped inside, the air carried the scent of lavender and salt. Everything looked untouched, as though Eleanor had just stepped out for a walk. Magnus led me upstairs to a small room with pale yellow walls. The crib still stood near the window, a quilt folded neatly inside. A wooden rocking horse rested in the corner, its paint chipped with age. On the dresser sat a box of envelopes tied together with ribbon. My hands trembled as I untied it. Each envelope was addressed in careful handwriting. To my Lila, for when you come home. The first letter was dated the day I'd been taken. My sweet girl, if you ever find this, know that not a day passes without me believing you're still out there. My vision blurred as I read. The words carried the rhythm of a heartbeat, steady, aching, full of faith. Another letter followed. When I hear the rain, I imagine you laughing. When I see a train, I imagine you sleeping safe somewhere. I pressed the paper to my chest, unable to hold back the tears. Magnus stood quietly nearby, his own eyes glistening. She wrote every year, he said, even when people told her to stop. He walked to the bookshelf and lifted a small blue chest. She kept this for you, too. Inside were tiny keepsakes, a silver locket, a photo of the three of us, a small toy train carved from wood. The house was filled with memories that belonged to a life I'd never lived but somehow recognized. I spent hours reading every letter until the light outside began to fade. Each page carried a piece of the woman I'd never met, but somehow felt I knew. For the first time, the hole inside me didn't feel endless. Before I left that night, Magnus handed me one more envelope. This was the last one, he said softly. She wrote it a week before she passed. The handwriting was unsteady but full of warmth. If you ever find your way home, remember this: your life didn't begin with what was stolen. It begins with what you choose to rebuild. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my bag. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of the ocean through the pines. I stood on the porch for a long time, looking out toward the dark waves, the sound of them steady and endless. Somewhere behind me, Magnus turned off the lights in the house, and I knew he was giving me space to say goodbye to the mother I'd never had the chance to thank. As the sky deepened to blue, I finally whispered a promise into the wind that I'd find a way to build something honest from everything that had been broken. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I knew it started here in this house that had been waiting for me all along. And somewhere deep inside, I could feel it, the quiet stirring of strength that comes only after the truth has burned everything else away. I stayed in Oregon longer than I planned. Every morning I'd wake to the sound of waves breaking against the cliffs and the faint scent of salt drifting through the open windows. Magnus kept his promises: small coffee waiting by the porch, quiet breakfasts where no one filled silence just to escape it. For the first time, I wasn't expected to perform. I could just exist. One afternoon, I found him in the garden behind the house repairing a small windmill that powered the old greenhouse. He glanced up as I stepped outside, smiling faintly. "Your mother always said this thing was too stubborn to quit," he said, brushing off his hands. The wind caught his silver hair, and for a moment I saw the exhaustion beneath his calm. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." I nodded, unsure how to tell him that every day here both healed and hurt me. That evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, Judith called. Her voice was measured, professional as always, but I could hear the weight behind each word. "The first court date has been set. Edward and Vivian's defense is pushing for a closed hearing." She hesitated before adding, "You don't have to testify, Claire. The evidence stands on its own." I sat by the window looking out toward the sea. The sky had turned violet, the water shining like glass. "I want to," I said finally. "I need to." Judith paused, then replied softly, "Then we'll make sure you're ready." The next few weeks passed in slow preparation. I met with her team, reviewed statements, read over transcripts that detailed every lie I'd grown up believing. Each page carried my name printed twice, once as Claire Donovan and again as Lila Carver. Seeing both together felt strange, like reading about two strangers who shared the same face. When the trial began, I returned to Chicago. The courthouse steps were crowded with cameras and microphones, reporters shouting questions I didn't answer. Inside, the air felt cold and sterile, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. Judith led me through the back corridor to avoid the chaos. Her hand on my shoulder was steady grounding. Edward sat at the defense table, his suit crisp hair perfectly combed as always. Vivian was beside him, small and pale, her hands trembling in her lap. Neither of them looked at me when I entered. The judge called the court to order, and I took my seat in the witness row waiting for my turn to speak. When they called my name, I stood. My heels clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing through the room. The clerk asked me to state my full name for the record. My voice wavered at first, then steadied. Lila Eleanor Carver. The sound of it filled the courtroom, and for a moment everything went still. The prosecutor began with simple questions. My age, my occupation the night of Edward's party. Then came the harder ones, what I remembered of my childhood, how I learned the truth, what it felt like to discover I'd been stolen. I answered as best I could, keeping my tone even measured. When I spoke about the night of the slap, the memory returned sharp as glass, the lights, the humiliation, the silence that followed. I thought it was the worst night of my life, I said quietly. But it was just the beginning. Edward sat motionless, staring at the table in front of him. When I spoke about the bracelet, the one he'd told me was a Donovan heirloom, he flinched slightly. Vivian pressed a tissue to her mouth, tears streaking down her face. I remember asking him once where it came from. I continued. He told me it belonged to his grandmother, but it wasn't his to give. The prosecutor nodded gently, signaling I could stop if I needed to. I didn't. I grew up thinking I was lucky, I said, that everything I had was a gift, but I understand now none of it was theirs to give me. The defense declined to cross-examine that day. When I stepped down, Judith met me near the benches, her voice barely above a whisper. You did well. I exhaled slowly, realizing I'd been holding my breath for most of the morning. Outside the courthouse, the air felt heavier than before. Reporters called after me, flashes going off, but I kept walking until I reached the corner where Magnus was waiting. He opened the car door without a word, and when I sat down, he handed me a thermos of tea. You handled yourself with grace, he said. Your mother would have been proud. The trial stretched over several weeks. Each day revealed another piece of what had been hidden bank transfers, falsified adoption papers, testimonies from the agency that had vanished years ago. The evidence was overwhelming. Vivian wept through most of it, her voice breaking as she described the miscarriages that drove her to desperation. Edward's expression never changed. He sat stiffly, jaw set, eyes fixed ahead, as if the truth belonged to someone else. When it was finally his turn to speak, he rose slowly. His voice carried across the courtroom, still deep and commanding, though stripped of the authority it once held. I gave her a life, he said, a better one than she would have had. The judge banged the gavel, warning him to stay on topic. He ignored it, turning toward me. You think you're better off without me? I made you who you are. I met his eyes steady and unflinching. You didn't make me, I said quietly. You stole me. A hush fell over the room. For the first time he faltered. The arrogance drained from his face, leaving behind something hollow. He sank back into his seat without another word. When the verdict came weeks later, the court was nearly silent. The judge read each count, kidnapping, fraud, obstruction, and found them both guilty. Vivian sobbed openly. Edward closed his eyes, his hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. The sentence was life imprisonment. Outside, the air smelled of spring rain, the city just beginning to thaw. Reporters swarmed the steps, their voices blending into a blur. I didn't stop. Magnus walked beside me, his hand hovering near my shoulder, as if he knew I needed space but not distance. That night, back at the hotel, I stood by the window watching the lights flicker across the skyline. For the first time in months, there were no knocks at my door, no phone calls, no noise, just the sound of traffic far below and the faint hum of the city breathing. I thought of Eleanor's letters, of the room she'd kept untouched for 33 years, of the life that had been waiting for me to claim it. Everything that had been taken was finally mine to rebuild. The next morning, Magnus handed me a set of papers across the breakfast table, property transfer forms for the Donovan estate. It's legally yours now, he said. I shook my head. I don't want it. Let them have their house. I want to build something honest. He smiled faintly. Then that's exactly what you should do. As I looked out the window at the waking city, I felt something shift inside me. Not peace yet, but something close. The past had finally been accounted for, and what came next was mine alone to decide. The trial had ended, but my story hadn't. It was time to choose what kind of life I would build from the truth that had set me free. When the sentencing ended, I expected closure, but what came instead was silence, a kind I didn't know how to fill. For weeks, I moved through life, as though underwater the world muffled and slow. The headlines faded, reporters chased new stories, and the city that once buzzed with my name learned to forget it. But forgetting wasn't something I could do. My whole life had been built on erasing the truth. Now I was learning to live inside it. I sold my apartment in Chicago. Every corner of that space whispered memories that didn't belong to me, photos taken in rooms I no longer recognized, furniture that felt borrowed air that felt borrowed too. Magnus helped with the logistics, though he never interfered. "You decide where home is," he said simply. So I packed what little was truly mine, a few canvases, my mother's letters, and the small wooden train she'd carved for me before I was taken. Portland became the natural choice. It was where my story had begun, even if I'd never known it. Magnus met me at the airport, his coat collar turned up against the coastal wind. "You look like your mother did when she first moved here," he said with a soft smile. His words caught me off guard. There was still a part of me that flinched every time someone compared me to a woman I'd never met, but I was learning to let the warmth of it stay. We drove straight to the old Carver house. I'd spent days there after the trial reading Eleanor's letters, touching the edges of a life frozen in time. Now it felt different, still sacred, but lighter somehow. Magnus had started restoring parts of it, repairing what years of neglect had worn down. "It's yours as much as mine," he said, as we walked through the front door. "But I think you need something that belongs only to you." That thought stayed with me for days. I spent long afternoons walking along the waterfront, tracing the city's rhythm. The smell of salt and cedar mixed in the air, the same scent that clung to the old letters I kept in my bag. It was during one of those walks that an idea began to form, small at first, but persistent. 2 months later, I signed a lease on a narrow brick studio near downtown Portland. The space had high windows that let in soft afternoon light and walls that still smelled faintly of sawdust. I named it Eleanor's Hands. The name came easily. It was what my biological mother had left behind, not wealth, not legacy, but care, the kind of love that fixed what time had broken. The first piece I restored in that studio was an oak writing desk, one that Magnus had quietly bought at the estate auction for me. "It used to sit in Edward's office," he said when it arrived. The mahogany gleamed under layers of dust. Its drawers stuck its corners scarred by time. For a long time I just stared at it, unsure what to feel. This desk had once been the center of everything false in my life, the place where my name was forged, where lies had been signed and sealed. When I finally began sanding its surface, I didn't do it to preserve Edward Donovan's memory. I did it to reclaim something. As the varnish peeled away, I thought about every night I'd worked quietly in my Chicago studio, while my father, the man I thought was mine, laughed at charity galas under chandeliers. Now each stroke of sandpaper felt like peeling off the last layer of his control. Magnus visited often, never for long, just enough to remind me I wasn't alone. He'd sit by the window with a book while I worked, the sound of the tools steady between us. "You have her patience," he said once. "Eleanor could fix anything, broken toys, broken chairs, broken hearts." I smiled without looking up. "I think she passed that on," I said. By spring, the workshop had become something real. Clients trickled in, local artists, antique dealers, even a retired librarian who brought in her father's old trunk to be repaired. I kept the sign simple, restoration by appointment only. Word spread quietly, not because of headlines or curiosity, but because the work spoke for itself. In the evenings after the last piece was finished and the tools were put away, I'd light a candle beside Eleanor's box of letters. The wax pooled slowly while I reread her words. The last letter she'd written had become my anchor. "If you ever find your way home, my darling girl, remember, your life doesn't begin with what was stolen. It begins with what you choose to rebuild." One night, Magnus arrived just as I was closing up. He carried a small velvet box. "I've been holding on to this for 33 years, he said quietly. Inside was a bracelet, the twin to the one I'd worn since childhood. The silver had dulled with time, but the tiny engraved train still gleamed under the lamplight. I fastened it next to mine, the metal cool against my skin. They should stay together, he said, like they were meant to. For a long moment we stood in silence, the sound of rain tapping gently against the window. The bracelet felt heavier than I expected, but in a comforting way, like a promise finally kept. Later that week, I visited the Carver house again. Magnus had been restoring the nursery, turning it into a quiet library in Eleanor's honor. The yellow walls had been repainted, but the rocking horse still stood in the corner. On the shelf next to her photograph, he'd placed a small brass plaque. For Eleanor and Lila, love that never stopped searching. I traced the letters with my fingertips, the metal warm from sunlight. Before I left, Magnus handed me an envelope sealed with a wax stamp. "This came from one of your mother's friends," he said. Inside was a short note from a woman named June Porter, Eleanor's old colleague from the school where she taught. She wrote about the day Eleanor first told her she was pregnant, how she'd laughed and cried at once, calling it the happiest miracle. The note ended with a single line that made my throat tighten. "She always said your hands would change lives one day." Back in my studio, I read the letter again before tucking it beside the others. The sun had started to set, casting long streaks of orange across the floor. I turned off the lights and stood for a moment listening to the faint hum of the city outside. It struck me then how full the silence had become, no longer heavy or lonely, but alive. It carried the sounds of new beginnings, the rustle of paper, the scrape of wood, the quiet strength of work that meant something. As I locked up for the night, I looked once more at the twin bracelets on my wrist, glinting softly under the light. For years they'd been a symbol of lies and loss. Now they were something different, proof that even after everything had been taken, some things could still be restored. The road ahead wasn't mapped out, but for the first time, that didn't scare me. The past had been faced, the truth had been spoken, and the pieces were finally falling into place. Somewhere beyond the rain and the ocean's edge, life was waiting, not borrowed, not stolen, but built with my own hands. And though I couldn't yet see where it would lead, I knew this much: I wasn't running anymore. I was home. The first morning of summer came quietly. The ocean mist rolled across the Oregon coast, soft and pale, while sunlight filtered through the tall windows of my workshop. The scent of varnish mixed with cedar shavings, and for the first time in years, the sound of the city outside no longer felt like a reminder of everything I'd lost. It just sounded like life. Work had been steady. The studio, once an empty shell, had become a place where stories of repair lived: old tables with burn marks, heirloom chairs missing legs, picture frames rescued from attics. People brought me pieces of their lives, and I returned them whole again. I didn't advertise much. Word spread on its own, one restoration at a time. Magnus stopped by every few weeks, usually on his way back from Seattle or a conference somewhere in the Bay Area. He never stayed long. He didn't need to. Just his presence, a warm greeting, a cup of coffee, a quiet look of pride was enough. He always asked the same thing before he left: "Are you happy?" And each time I found it easier to answer yes. One afternoon, a young woman stood hesitantly in the doorway. She couldn't have been older than her mid-20s, her dark hair pulled into a loose braid, her jacket still damp from the rain. "Are you still taking interns?" she asked softly. Her name was Maya Thompson, a local art student finishing her degree in conservation. Her portfolio was thin, but full of heart sketches of broken ceramics, handwritten notes about pigments, old postcards turned into practice canvases. I offered her the apprenticeship on the spot. Something about her felt familiar, the way she handled each piece with quiet respect. Within weeks, she was part of the rhythm, sanding, polishing, learning to listen to the wood. Watching her reminded me of how my own hands had once trembled when I started out. The work steadied her, the same way it had steadied me. On a slow afternoon, she asked about the studio's name. "Why, Eleanor's Hands." I glanced toward the shelf where my mother's letters were kept. "Because some things stay mended even after they're gone," I said. She nodded, not pressing for more. I could see she understood that some answers weren't meant to be dissected, only felt. Later that month, Judith came by with paperwork for me to sign. The Donovan estate had finally been liquidated, and a portion of it, through the court's order, was now allocated to me. She explained every clause carefully, pausing before adding, "You can walk away from all of it if you want. No one would blame you." I signed without hesitation, but redirected most of it to create something new, a foundation in Eleanor's name, offering grants to women studying restoration arts. It felt right. Justice didn't always need to roar. Sometimes it could build quietly instead. When the paperwork was done, Judith smiled. "Your mother would have liked that," she said. "She believed in giving people a second chance." That evening, Magnus stopped by with takeout and a stack of letters he'd found while cleaning his home office. "These were from the early days after you were taken," he said, placing the bundle on my work table. The envelopes were yellowed edges, soft with age. I opened one carefully. Eleanor's handwriting looped across the page, steady, deliberate, full of hope that somehow defied the years. "If she's out there, tell her I love her," every morning she had written. "Tell her she's still the best thing I ever made." The tears came before I could stop them. Magnus reached over and squeezed my hand, his thumb brushing gently across the back of my palm. She meant every word he said. The weight of the letters wasn't heavy, it was grounding. Each word reminded me of where I came from, of how love could outlast time and distance and loss. As summer deepened, the workshop grew busier. Maya had become confident, her laughter filling the quiet corners that once echoed only with the sound of tools. Sometimes she'd stay late helping finish a project or just talking about her life growing up in foster care, studying art on borrowed grants, finding meaning in restoration because it mirrored her own story. "I used to think fixing things was about undoing damage," she said one night, sanding an old clock face smooth. "But now I think it's about honoring what survived." Her words stayed with me long after she went home. In her, I saw pieces of my younger self searching for worth, trying to make sense of a life built from fragments. It wasn't lost on me that maybe this was what Eleanor had done all along, build, teach, and love, quietly trusting that one day it would matter. When fall arrived, I held the first open house for the foundation. We hosted it at the studio, small, simple, with the windows open to the cool breeze. Magnus stood beside me, looking out over the small crowd of artists, donors, and students. "Your mother would have been proud," he said softly. I smiled. "So are you." The evening light poured through the glass, catching on the twin bracelets around my wrist. The silver glimmered softly, one slightly worn, the other polished bright. They were the same but not identical, like past and present, sitting side by side. Near the end of the night, I found myself standing by the door, watching guests drift out into the street. Maya lingered behind, holding a brochure she'd helped design. "You know," she said with a small smile, "this place, it doesn't just fix things. It gives people permission to start again." After she left, I sat alone for a while, the scent of varnish and ocean wind mingling in the air. The clock on the wall ticked softly the same way it had in Eleanor's letters, a rhythm of time moving forward, not backward. I looked around at the tables, the unfinished projects, the candle burning beside the box of letters, and felt a calm I hadn't known before. The truth had torn my life apart, but it had also built something new in its place, something honest. I was no longer the daughter who had to earn her family's love, or the woman trying to prove her worth. I was simply myself, Lila Eleanor Carver, a name that finally felt like home. When I turned out the lights, the workshop glowed faintly from the street lamps outside. The ocean's hum drifted through the night, steady and familiar. Tomorrow would bring more work, more people, more lives crossing paths for reasons that had nothing to do with the past. And for the first time, that thought didn't ache at all. Somewhere in the dark, I could almost hear Eleanor's voice, soft, sure, and full of peace, reminding me that what's broken can still become beautiful again. And as I locked the door and stepped into the cool night air, I knew that was exactly what I was meant to keep doing. Autumn came soft and slow that year. The maples along the Oregon coast turned to gold, scattering their leaves like quiet reminders that even endings can be beautiful. The days shortened, but the studio glowed late into the evenings, filled with the hum of sanders, the scent of pine dust, and the sound of Maya's laughter echoing against the brick walls. Work had found its rhythm again, not the hurried kind that chased deadlines, but the kind that came from peace. I spent most mornings opening the windows before sunrise, letting the ocean breeze move through the workshop. Light touched every piece of furniture waiting to be restored, every letter from my mother resting in its box by the window. Her words had become my compass, steady and kind, guiding me each day I reached for something broken and tried to make it whole again. The foundation grew quietly, almost without notice. What began as a small scholarship became a network of artists and restorers, mostly women, who had rebuilt their lives after hardship. Magnus attended our first grant ceremony in November. He stood at the back of the room clapping softly as each recipient's name was called. When it ended, he leaned close and said, "She would have loved this, you know." I smiled. "You mean Mom?" He nodded, eyes warm. "No, both of you." A week later, I received a letter from the prison in Illinois. The return address belonged to Vivian. It wasn't long, just a page and a half written in small, uncertain handwriting. She said she finally understood what it meant to love, without owning that she was sorry for the years she let silence do the hurting for her. There was no demand, no plea, just regret folded neatly between the lines. I didn't write back, not because I was angry, but because some apologies are meant to rest where they land. As winter approached, the world outside grew quiet again. Business slowed, and the studio took on a stillness that felt almost sacred. On the final evening before Christmas, Magnus came by with a small wooden crate. "A delivery from storage," he said, brushing off the snow from his coat. Inside was an old toy chest, the one from the yellow nursery my mother had refused to change all those years. The paint was faded, one hinge rusted, but it still bore the initials she'd carved by hand, L.E.C. We spent hours repairing it together. Magnus steadied the lid while I replaced the hinges and buffed the sides until the grain shone again. When we finished, he smiled faintly. "Your mother built this for your first birthday," he said quietly. "She wanted something you'd grow into, not out of." I traced the carved letters, the wood smooth beneath my fingertips. "She did," I said. After he left, I placed the chest beneath the window and filled it with the things that told the story of how my life had come apart and come together. The silver bracelets, the train charm, a copy of the first scholarship check, and a single folded letter that read, "For when you forget how far you've come." On New Year's Day, I walked along the shoreline just beyond the studio. The tide was low, revealing smooth stones and small shells scattered across the sand. The air was cold enough to sting, but the sky was clear, streaked with pale light. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one who once stood crying in the snow outside a ballroom, convinced her life had ended. I thought of the woman who found her truth buried in a file and a photograph, and of the mother who never stopped believing she'd come home. It struck me then that justice hadn't arrived in a courtroom, though the law had done its part. It had arrived here in the quiet, in the work, in every choice to rebuild instead of resent. Healing had never been about erasing what happened. It was about learning that what's taken from you doesn't have to define you forever. That night before closing the studio, I lit one last candle beside my mother's letters. The flame flickered gently, its reflection dancing across the window pane. Outside, rain began to fall soft and steady, washing over the street until everything glowed. I whispered a thank you to the woman who waited, to the father who never stopped searching, and to the version of myself who finally learned what home really meant. I locked the door, stepped into the mist, and felt the weight of the years settle into something lighter. My story had started with lies and loss, but it ended here in truth, in forgiveness, and in the quiet rhythm of a life rebuilt by love and steady hands. If you've listened this far, thank you for sharing this journey with me. Maybe you've carried your own kind of brokenness, or maybe you've helped someone else put theirs back together. Either way, I hope this story reminds you that peace doesn't come from what we lose. It comes from what we choose to restore. And if it touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to begin again.